Is it really that bad to run a budget deficit? And how do we fix ours? Hello, members, super savers, and bond course fans. I hope you're healthy and well. Welcome to part one of our two-part mini-series on the budget deficit, the 2024 election, and your treasuries. So, we ran a community poll recently asking the question, what should the U.S. do to reduce its budget deficit? More than 80% of you said cut spending, and less than 20% of you said raise taxes. And I can tell you from these 89 comments that we read through, many of you seem to hold some quite strong opinions on this topic. And rightfully so, given that the budget deficit is being funded by the same treasuries that many of us here in our Diamond NestEgg community hold in our fixed income portfolios. And in the end, pay for with our taxes. So with that in mind, here are the three topics that we'll be covering in today's video. 1. Is it really that bad to run a budget deficit? Quite a few people assume that having a budget deficit must automatically be bad, but that's not necessarily the case in every situation. And that's what we'll be talking about here, as well as what's wrong with our budget deficit specifically. 2. Where are all those government and tax dollars going? And 3. How can we fix our budget deficit? And yes, in this section, we're actually going to show you how much spending we would need to cut or how much in taxes we would need to raise to get our budget deficit under control, more or less. As usual, here's our front of video disclaimer. For a detailed disclaimer, please refer to the end of this video. Let's dive in now, folks. A budget deficit happens when the government spends more money than it brings in. But despite what some folks may think, running a budget deficit is not always and necessarily a bad thing for a country. In fact, most large developed countries run a budget deficit. According to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook from October 2024, the major advanced economies, which include the US, the Euro area, Japan, the UK, and Canada together are projected to run a budget deficit for 2024 of 6.2% of GDP on average, with the US budget deficit projected to be a bit on the higher end at 7.6%. This number here for the US is expected to come in a bit lower at 7% for 2024 if we look at projections by an organization closer to home, our own country's Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which provides nonpartisan analysis for the U.S. Congress. But for the purposes of this analysis, we can say that the CBO number is in the same ballpark as the IMF's. And because I know that at least a few people will ask, no, China's budget deficit numbers don't look much better. Here's where they stood as of April 2024, according to the IMF, at 7.4% of GDP. And who would have thought that China, as an emerging economic power, would run a budget deficit that's basically as large as the US one in relative terms? The point is, a budget deficit on its own does not necessarily imply an ominous future for a country, because it only tells one side of the story. And the other side of the story is GDP. Gross domestic product. The combined value of all goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time, and whether GDP is growing fast enough to support the debt that is also growing within a country. This is known as a country's debt to GDP ratio. A country's debt to GDP ratio is in principle a bit like our own personal debt to income ratio. For example, if our income keeps growing, we can afford a larger mortgage and/or mortgage payment. Say that this year we have $100,000 of debt outstanding, and our income is $100,000. Our debt to income ratio is 100%, approximately where the debt to GDP ratio stands for the US at the time of this taping. Now, say that next year we have $120,000 of debt outstanding, but our income has increased to $120,000 as well. Our debt to income ratio is still exactly 100%, like it was last year. So in theory, we should still be fine with our increased debt level for next year, because in relative terms, not much has changed. our debt-to-income ratio has stayed constant at 100%. In fact, we could even be better off next year despite this higher absolute debt level. If we assume an annual interest rate of 10% on our debt, this year, our interest payment would be $10,000 on the $100,000 of debt we owe. Deduct this interest payment of $10,000 from our income of $100,000 here, and here's what we would have left over for other expenses, $90,000. Assuming the same annual interest rate of 10% on our debt, next year our interest payment would be $12,000 on our new debt level of $120,000. However, because our income has grown as well to $120,000, if we deduct this interest payment of $12,000 from our new income of $120,000 here, here's what we would have left over for other expenses, $108,000. So, our net income after debt service has grown from $90,000 to $108,000, despite the increase in our absolute debt level from $100,000 to $120,000, simply because our debt and the associated interest payments didn't outgrow our income. And this debt-to-income ratio, as I mentioned earlier, our own personal debt-to-income ratio, is in principle a bit like a country's debt to GDP ratio, meaning that so long as a country's GDP continues to grow as fast or faster than its debt, so long as this debt to income or debt to GDP ratio stays constant or goes down, a country's budget deficit and growing national debt does not necessarily have to be a bad thing. But of course, to make sure a country can actually grow its GDP faster than its debt, it would be very helpful if the money from the deficit is spent wisely, for example, on productive investments, infrastructure, and education. And in some situations, raising debt may even be the only realistic way for a country to be able to finance some of these investments. So, while debt per se is not always and necessarily bad, the problem is that our country's debt to GDP ratio has not stayed constant or gone down. In fact, the debt to GDP ratio for the US has been going up, and quite steeply so in recent years. In other words, the core issue is not that we have a budget deficit per se, because as I just showed you, most large developed countries, as well as emerging economies such as China, run budget deficits. The reality is that growing countries, and in particular fast-growing countries like ours, sometimes need to run a budget deficit to keep investing and growing. The core issue, as I mentioned earlier, is that our budget deficit, our debt pile, and our associated interest payments have been growing and are expected to keep growing much faster than our economy, than our GDP. The CBO projects deficit levels for 2024 at 7% of GDP, and for 2025 at 6.5% of GDP, significantly higher than the projected GDP growth rate for 2024 of 4.6% and for 2025 of 4.1%. And that's why the CBO also projects that federal debt held by the public will reach 122% of GDP by 2034, up from 99% of GDP in 2024, and the highest at any point in history, including the 2 world wars in the 20th century. To keep the debt to GDP ratio stable at the 99% level that it is currently at, the federal government would need to make sure that our deficit will not keep growing at 7% of GDP for 2024 and at 6.5% of GDP for 2025. Rather, debt levels for 2024 and 2025 would need to grow at a similar rate to GDP. Remember this point and these GDP growth projections from the CBO, because we will be coming back to them when we talk about how to fix things towards the end of this video. Before we get to that though, and now that we understand that the real problem with our budget deficit is not simply that our debt is growing, but that it's growing faster than GDP, let's take a look at what all the debt and our taxes are being used to pay for. And afterwards, we'll move on to the spending reductions and or tax hikes that will be needed to resolve the situation. So, here is the summary of the CBO's 2024 budget outlook. On this side, we have total dollars coming into the federal government, made up primarily from individual income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and other areas, bringing total federal revenue to $4,890 billion, or 71% of the total dollars coming into the federal government. The remainder of incoming dollars comes from the federal deficit, or net new borrowing, amounting to $1,990 billion, or 29% of the total dollars coming into the federal government, bringing us to a total of $6,880 billion coming into the federal government for 2024. And yes, this does mean that in addition to the taxes we pay here in various capacities, about 1/3 of our federal government spending is funded by net new debt, those treasuries that many of us own in our fixed income portfolios. On this side, we have total dollars going out of the federal government. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, marketplace subsidies, and other mandatory are all mandatory spending, meaning that there is a law that mandates this spending. So we would need to change that law to change these mandatory spending numbers. Other mandatory include student loans, food stamps, deposit insurance, clean vehicle, and energy-related tax credits. Next up, we have defense and other non-defense spending, both of which are discretionary, meaning that the administration can decide on these expenses as long as they stay within the budget appropriations. No additional separate law is required to change these spending amounts. Other non-defense spending that is discretionary includes transportation, education, housing, and social services programs, as well as science and environmental organizations. And of course, before we forget, we also have here the net interest on federal debt that the government has to pay every year. This budget position is not just mandatory, but pretty much non-negotiable, as it is underpinned by the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution. And there you have it, my fixed income friends. This here is the government spending that is being funded by our tax dollars and treasuries here. So, does any of this surprise you or not? And if it does surprise you, what about it surprises you the most? Drop a comment below and let the community know. Now, let's move on to the next and possibly most interesting part of today's video, and the part that we had the most fun figuring out. There are typically three ways for a proper developed country to fix its budget deficit: raise taxes, cut spending, or use a mixture of both. And no, we will not explore our country defaulting on its debt or going into hyperinflation as a means of reducing its real debt burden. These methods have been tested by Argentina, repeatedly even over the past few decades, and have resulted in Argentina falling down the global pecking order from one of the wealthiest states to, let's say, one of the significantly more troubled ones, whose debt many, myself included, would not have touched with a 10-foot pole or even a 100-foot pole for a long time. We're not a banana republic, so let's focus today's discussion on raising taxes or cutting spending as a means of fixing our budget deficit. And let's do this first in the context of a balanced budget, primarily because we get a lot of questions from folks about balanced budgets. A balanced budget essentially means that our government would not need to issue any net new debt in any given year, that all the spending on this side, everything, should be covered by total federal revenue on this side, namely taxes and other federal income, as we can see here. The government would spend exactly what it takes in, no more, no less. In other words, in a balanced budget world, this federal deficit number, this net new borrowing number of $1,990 billion would disappear and go to zero. Under such a scenario, if the federal government were to fund this entire $6,880 billion in spending here from its incoming revenue, they would need to raise another $1,990 billion in taxes on top of this $4,890 billion of federal revenue, representing a 41% tax increase across the board. The other way this could work in a balanced budget world would be via cutting spending on this side by $1,990 billion to $4,890 billion. In this case, federal revenue would also fully cover total spending without any net new borrowing. This represents a 29% spending cut across the board. So, to repeat, in a balanced budget world where there is no net new borrowing by the government, we would need to either raise taxes by 41% across the board or cut spending by 29% across the board, or something maybe slightly less unpleasant if we do a combination of tax hikes and spending cuts. But however we do it, there's no way around the fact that we will need to plug a $1,990 billion hole if we want to balance our budget. And if your general inclination is to raise taxes, you should know that according to the Tax Foundation's 2024 update, the top 50% of all taxpayers paid 97.7% of all federal individual income taxes, while the bottom 50% paid the remaining 2.3%. If, on the other hand, your general inclination is to cut spending, remember that Social Security is the largest single position in the budget, with Medicare and other health-related programs not far behind. As always, curious minds want to know, how would you approach this challenge? Would you raise taxes or would you cut spending? And which of these categories here would you reduce first? Or would you combine some tax increases with some spending cuts, as often happens in real life when a country tries to balance its budget? Drop a comment below and let the community know. In any case, a balanced budget would be really nice because while it will not reduce the outstanding debt in absolute terms, over time and as the economy keeps growing, it would help bring down this debt to GDP ratio here that we showed you earlier and allow the federal government to have some built-in wiggle room for bad times that will surely hit us at some point. Now, we did have balanced budgets and even some slight budget surpluses in the past. It's clearly not impossible, but you should also know that the last time the federal government actually had a balanced budget was more than 20 years ago, for the few years between 1998 to 2001, under former President Bill Clinton. Here's the thing though, in my mind, the first task at hand isn't really achieving a balanced budget right now. Given where we currently are with our out-of-control spending, it would probably be a bit too much to try to immediately start bringing down this debt to GDP ratio aggressively. That's like trying to run before you can walk. The first task at hand in my mind is actually to just stabilize this debt to GDP ratio, to keep it where it is and prevent it from going from here to here. Which brings me back to what I said in the first part of today's video. To keep the debt to GDP ratio stable, what we actually need to do is make sure that our debt does not grow faster than GDP, that it grows at a similar pace to GDP. In other words, we need to reduce new debt, but we don't have to completely eliminate new debt in the first step. So, to make a long story short so that we don't have to add another 15 minutes to this video, we worked with the official numbers from the CBO and did some modeling. And it can be complex as finance and financial modeling so often are. But if we calculate the deficit reduction required to stabilize our national debt held by the public at 99% of GDP, pretty much where we are now, we would need to bring down the 2024 deficit pro forma by about a third. And let's use $700 billion as a rounded number for our purposes here. If we could achieve this deficit reduction of about $700 billion, if we could reduce the deficit by about a third from its current level, we would have the U.S. national debt on a more or less stable path, and the debt pile would not grow as a percentage of GDP like it's projected to do so here. And we would again have the same tools available that we discussed before to achieve this target deficit reduction of approximately $700 billion. We could either increase taxes by 14% across the board or decrease spending by 10% across the board. Or again, use a mix of both tax increases and spending cuts. It's still not pretty, but much more realistic and achievable than the dramatic increase in taxes by 41% or decrease in spending by 29% that we talked about earlier under the balanced budget scenario. So, in my mind, while stabilizing the US debt pile at the current level will not be fun and require compromises on all sides, it probably is something that can be done if we really want to do it as a nation. And of course, I'm speaking as a finance person here, as someone who's running this bond-focused channel and is watching government spending and deficits very closely on behalf of our Diamond NestEgg community, many of whom hold treasuries in their portfolios. I'm not a politician and can't comment on how you would actually tackle the challenge in Washington, how you would decide on the mix between tax increases and spending cuts, and how you would finally get all sides to come around and to accept some of the painful measures that will be required. But in a nutshell, the federal government needs to do something about our budget deficit sooner rather than later. And this something does not mean that it has to stop net new borrowing altogether in the first step to keep its prime financial ratings, but that it does need to start looking at ways to bring net new borrowing down to a level that is more in line with the pace of GDP growth. Leave a comment below. What do you think? All right, members, super savers, and bond course fans, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. And stay tuned for part 2 of our 2-part mini-series on the budget deficit, the 2024 election, and your treasuries. And as always, if you want to really get up to speed on bond investing and building out your bond portfolio before rates could potentially go down, then check out this video here on our 2024 bond courses. Or come join our next live member Q&A on Sunday, November 24th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time, where we'll be diving deeper into all things fixed income. I've also linked all the details on our bond courses and YouTube Super Saver membership below this video for your convenience. See you again very soon with more brand new wealth building content for your financial journey.